a world without the internet. No breaking news alerts on your phone, no live streams. Just the daily paper, delivered right to your doorstep. For millions, that paper was a sacred morning ritual, a trusted window into the world. Now, imagine picking up that paper, the ink still fresh, and reading a headline so impossible, so chilling, it would redefine your understanding of time itself. A headline that reported a catastrophic crash. Not a crash that happened yesterday, or even a year ago, but one that wouldn't actually occur for another 40 years. This isn't science fiction. This isn't some crazy conspiracy theory. It's a real story, buried in the archives. And it's about to challenge everything you thought you knew about coincidences, premonitions, and the very fabric of reality. Hey everyone, before we dive into this wild story, if you're as fascinated by the mysteries of history as I am, do me a huge favor, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive. It really helps us keep bringing you these incredible stories. The year is 1939. Europe is a powder keg on the brink of explosion, and the world is holding its breath. But on this particular morning, our story isn't about war. It's about a small, unassuming paper local publication that, for a brief moment, seemed to hold a secret from the future. The paper was the Herald, and what was printed on its pages that day was nothing short of impossible. For decades, the story of the Herald lay dormant, a rumor, a footnote in history that most people dismissed as just another tall tale. You see, the original article, as the legend goes, reported on a horrific air crash. It was a tragedy that, to the best of everyone's knowledge, had never happened. The article was a detailed account of a plane that went down, taking the lives of its crew and passengers. It was written with the somber finality of a breaking news report, full of names, details, and even a speculative cause for the disaster. But here's the thing that makes this story so captivating. That crash, the one detailed in the paper, did not happen in 1939. It didn't happen in 1949, or 1959. In fact, it wouldn't happen for another 40 years. The details were eerily impossibly accurate. How could a newspaper in the pre-digital age, with no advanced warning systems or sophisticated forecasting, report on an event that was still so far in the future? Was it a bizarre, isolated incident of journalistic malpractice? Or was it something far stranger? Something that tugs at the very edges of our understanding of time? We have to understand what the world was like in 1939 to really grasp the impact of this. Information was slow. News traveled at the speed of a printing press and a delivery truck. People trusted their newspapers implicitly. There were no fake news labels or online fact-checkers. So for a paper to print something so clearly, so definitively, and for it to be utterly wrong, that would have been a scandal. Yet it wasn't. The article, if it existed at all, was seemingly forgotten, buried under the weight of world events until it was accidentally unearthed decades later. And that's where the real mystery begins. The article described the crash with a level of detail that feels chilling in retrospect. It named the flight number, the type of aircraft, and even the number of casualties. It spoke of a pilot's desperate struggle and a community in shock. But here's the crucial part. There were no witnesses to this supposed crash in 1939 because it never happened. The world kept spinning, oblivious to the fact that one small newspaper had, for a moment, held a snapshot of the future. The page turned, the paper was recycled, and the world moved on. But that snapshot was still out there, waiting for the future to catch up. We're left with a series of unnerving questions. Did anyone in 1939 read this and feel a pang of dread? Did they question their sanity, or just dismiss it as a simple printing error? The truth is, we don't know. The trail of the original paper is cold, a ghost in the historical record, but the story of what it reported? That story is very, very real. And to understand it, we need to fast forward for decades to a day, when the future finally collided with the past. 40 years is a long time. The world of 1979 was a galaxy away from the world of 1939. We survived a world war, landed on the moon, and were on the cusp of the information age. The local newspaper, once the central source of truth, was now just one voice among many. But on this specific day, in this specific place, the past and the future were about to meet in a horrifying, undeniable way. The date was October 31st, 1979, Halloween, a day usually filled with costumes and candy. But for the community of Des Plaines, Illinois, it would be a day of unimaginable tragedy. On a routine flight from Boston, a DC-10 aircraft, Flight 191, suddenly suffered a catastrophic engine failure just after takeoff from O'Hare International Airport. The engine, a massive hunk of metal and machinery, tore from the wing. The plane, already struggling for altitude, rolled sharply and plummeted to the ground in a fiery explosion. The crash was a national tragedy, the deadliest aviation accident in U.S. history at the time. All 271 passengers and crew on board were killed. On the ground, 2 people were also killed, bringing the total number of victims to 273. The sheer scale of the disaster was impossible to comprehend. The crash site was a scene of utter devastation, a testament to the brutal finality of such an event. The news broke, spreading like wildfire across the country. Eyewitnesses, news reporters, and investigators descended on the scene, all trying to piece together what went wrong. This is where our story gets truly bizarre. It's said that a man, a relative of one of the victims, was going through some old family belongings when he stumbled upon the old newspaper from 1939. Maybe he was looking for a distraction, or maybe it was just a random act of fate. The paper was yellowed and brittle, but the ink on one particular article was still legible. It was the report of an air crash, a plane, a DC-10. It spoke of a catastrophic engine failure on takeoff. The number of victims was chillingly close to the final tally. It was a DC-10, an aircraft that, to be clear, didn't even exist in 1939. The article described the event with a familiarity that was both uncanny and utterly impossible. How could a journalist for decades before its creation know the name of a specific type of airliner, the details of its failure, and the approximate number of casualties? It was as if someone had handed them a pre-written news report from the future. The man, understandably, was in a state of shock. He couldn't believe his eyes. He shared the discovery, and soon, the impossible story began to spread. The implications were staggering. Was this a genuine case of precognition, a glimpse into a future written in stone? Or was there another explanation, one that didn't involve bending the laws of physics? The story of the newspaper and the crash of Flight 191 became an urban legend, a bizarre historical footnote that refused to go away. It's a story that perfectly illustrates how a single detail, a single impossible connection, can turn a tragic event into a profound and unsettling mystery. So with the facts of the crash now established and the ghost of the 1939 newspaper hanging over everything, we have to ask ourselves, was the man who found the paper a lucky truth seeker, or was he a key part of a much larger deception? When a story like this emerges, our minds naturally race to the most extraordinary explanations. We are captivated by the idea that there's more to the world than meets the eye, that the impossible might just be possible. So, what else? The first thing that comes to mind when an old newspaper accurately predicts a future tragedy? Time travel. The theory goes something like this. A time traveler, perhaps from the late 20th century, made a stop in 1939. Maybe it was an accident, maybe they were conducting some kind of research. While there, something was left behind, a small slip of paper, a digital file that was somehow converted to a physical artifact. Or maybe, and this is where it gets really interesting, they were a journalist themselves, and they accidentally wrote a story for their modern paper that somehow ended up in the past. It's a tantalizing thought, isn't it? A rogue time traveler, an accidental paradox, a subtle tear in the fabric of history that was only visible to a handful of people decades later. But if we're going to talk about time travel, we also have to consider the butterfly effect. Would a time traveler, knowing a disaster was going to happen, not try to prevent it? This is where the story gets its ethical backbone. If a time traveler was responsible for the article, were they trying to warn the world? Did they believe that by publishing a cryptic, impossible story, they could subtly alter the course of events? Or was it a mistake, an act of negligence that resulted in one of the most chilling historical documents ever discovered? The silence of the time traveler, the lack of any further evidence, is as much a part of the mystery as the paper itself. Then, there's the theory of precognition. What if the reporter who wrote the article was a visionary? Someone with a rare, inexplicable gift to see into the future. It's a concept as old as humanity itself, of prophets and seers who could glimpse events before they happened. Perhaps this journalist had a vivid, detailed dream of a future disaster, the specific aircraft, the location, the nature of the crash, and perhaps, in a fit of artistic or journalistic inspiration, they decided to write the story as if it were happening in the present. In this scenario, the article isn't a mistake, but a prophecy, a warning that went unheeded, because how could anyone in 1939 take such a thing seriously? Finally, there's the idea of parallel universes. What if the newspaper didn't predict the future of our timeline, but rather reported on an event that happened in another, slightly different reality? A reality where a crash identical to the one in 1979 actually took place in 1939. And what if, for a brief, inexplicable moment, the veil between these two realities thinned, allowing a single article from that other world to bleed through into our own? This is the kind of stuff that fuels late-night conversations and sci-fi films. And it's a theory that, while completely unprovable, is almost too perfect not to consider. These are the fantastic, cinematic explanations that make this story so compelling. They're what keep us coming back to it, decades after it was first told. They touch on our deepest desires to believe in something more, to find a hidden order in a chaotic world. But are they the truth? Or is the truth something far more grounded, far more mundane, and in its own way, just as fascinating? To figure that out, we have to put on our detective hats and start looking for the real clues. As much as we love the idea of time travelers and prophecies, a good mystery isn't solved by leaping to the most exciting conclusion. It's solved by looking at the facts, the evidence, and the subtle details that everyone else overlooks. So, let us take a step back and examine the evidence itself. The alleged 1939 newspaper article, The first thing to understand is that the article itself is incredibly difficult to find. For decades, it existed primarily as a photocopy of a photocopy, a faded, blurry image passed around online forums and in strange books. This alone should raise a red flag. In the digital age, a verifiable artifact like this would have been scanned, archived, and analyzed by dozens of people. The fact that the original paper is so elusive is a major point of skepticism. It's hard to analyze the text of a ghost, but let's work with what we have. The article, in its various forms, mentions a DC-10 aircraft. This is the single most damning detail for the hoaxbusters and the most compelling for the believers. The Douglas DC-10 was a Tridget wide-body airliner that first flew in 1970. It was not even on the drawing board in 1939. So how could a newspaper reporter possibly know that name? This is the central pillar of the entire mystery. However, a closer look at some of the reproductions of the article reveals a fascinating possibility. The text is often grainy, and some people have suggested that the letters DC-10 could be a misinterpretation. For instance, in an old-style font, the letters CIO could, with a little imagination and a lot of wishful thinking, look like a badly printed DC-10. It's not a perfect explanation, but it's a possibility that has to be considered. Our brains are hardwired to find patterns, and sometimes, they find patterns that aren't really there. Another crucial detail is the reporting style. The supposed article reads with a certain level of detail that feels anachronistic. Would a 1939 newspaper with limited information really be so specific about the type of plane and the exact number of casualties so soon after a crash? News reporting was different back then. The focus was often on the human element, not the technical specifics of the aircraft. This raises the question of whether the article was written in 1939 at all, or if it was a clever fabrication created much later, with the benefit of hindsight. We also have to consider the context of the crash itself. The 1979 disaster of Flight 191 was a huge story. It was widely reported on for weeks, if not months. The details of the DC-10, the engine separation, and the number of victims were all public knowledge. So, for a clever prankster or a creative writer, it would have been very easy to retroactively write a 1939 newspaper article and make it sound like an impossible prophecy. All they would need is a little historical knowledge, a vintage typewriter, and an old-looking piece of paper. This brings us to a more grounded, and perhaps more likely, conclusion. The evidence, when examined without the desire for a fantastical answer, begins to crumble. The blurry text, the anachronistic details, the missing original source. They all point to something other than a time-bending paradox. The most powerful magic trick is often the one that's right in front of you. And in this case, the trick might have been played on all of us. So, if it wasn't time travel or prophecy, what exactly was it? Was it a simple mistake, or a brilliant and carefully orchestrated deception? So, what if the entire thing was a magnificent lie? Not a time travel paradox or a prophetic vision, but a carefully constructed hoax designed to fool a wide-eyed public. The possibility is a lot more compelling than you might think. After all, the best hoaxes aren't about making people believe something absurd. They're about using just enough real information to make the absurd seem plausible. The story of the newspaper only began to circulate widely in the late 1970s and early 1980s, right in the aftermath of the actual crash. This is a crucial detail. The story didn't exist in the public consciousness before the disaster. It only emerged after it. So who would have had the motive and the means to create such a thing? One possibility is a family member of a victim, driven by grief and a desire to find meaning in a senseless tragedy. By creating a document that seemed to predict the future, they could turn a random, brutal accident into a preordained event. It's a macabre way of finding closure, a way to believe that the person's death wasn't just a matter of terrible luck, but a part of some larger, cosmic plan. This is a powerful human impulse, and it's one that has fueled countless legends throughout history. Another possibility is a journalist, maybe a young reporter, seeing the media frenzy around the crash, decided to create a sensational story that would go viral long before viral was a word. They could have used an old blank newspaper page and a vintage typewriter to fabricate the article. All they would need to do is get the details of the crash correct, which were all over the news at the time, and then make the print look old and weathered. It's a kind of journalistic stunt, a way of testing the public's gullibility, or simply an elaborate joke that got out of hand. The beauty of a good hoax is that it's nearly impossible to disprove. If the original document can't be found, and all we have are blurry photocopies, how can you definitively say it's a fake? You can point out the inconsistencies, the anachronisms, and the lack of a paper trail. But a true believer will just say, that's part of the mystery. The hoax, in a way, becomes self-perpetuating. But let's get into the specifics of how such a hoax could have been executed. For example, a common practice in the old newspaper business was ghosting. A newsman might use an old edition of a paper, strip it of its original content, and then reprint a new story on it to make it look old. This would explain why the paper looks authentic. while the story on it, docenti, matched the historical record. It's the perfect crime, because the evidence of the crime, the reprinted page, looks exactly like the real thing. The story could have also been a piece of what is known as fake lore, a term for a story or belief created deliberately to resemble authentic folklore. The legend of the prophetic newspaper could have started as a campfire story, an urban legend told to friends and family. And then, as the decades passed, people forgot where they heard it. The story took on a life of its own, becoming more and more credible with each telling, until people began to believe it was a genuine historical event. The human element is what makes this so compelling. A hoax isn't just about deception, it's about a relationship between the deceiver and the deceived. It's a story about a trick that was so well executed it managed to live for 40 years, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal its clever punchline. But if it was a hoax, who was the culprit, and why did they do it? We've considered the fantastical, we've explored the possibility of a grand deception. But what if the real story is much simpler, much more elegant, and in its own way, just as mind-bending? The truth, it turns out, often hides in plain sight, disguised as a mundane detail or a historical footnote. This is where the mystery finally unravels, not with a bang, but with a quiet, logical reveal. The key to the whole puzzle lies not in time travel, but in a series of events that began long before the 1979 crash. The story of the prophetic newspaper article is not one story, but two stories that were merged together over time. First, let us look at the newspaper article from 1939. While the specific Herald paper with the DC-10 story is likely a fabrication, there was a real tragedy that occurred around that time that might have served as the inspiration. In October 1939, a DC-3 airliner, flying from Chicago to St. Louis, crashed shortly after takeoff from Chicago's Municipal Airport, the predecessor to Midway. The crash was a major news story in Chicago and was reported in detail. Now a DC-3 is not a DC-10, but to a casual observer, or to someone retelling a story decades later, the names could easily get confused, especially since both were Douglas commercial aircraft. So, we have a real crash, a real newspaper report, and a time period that aligns with the legend. It's a key piece of the puzzle. But what about the other piece, the DC-10? The legend of the newspaper only truly took off in the early 1980s, when it was widely circulated in a chain letter format and later in fringe publications. It's during this time that a new piece of information was almost certainly added. The story of a DC-10 crash in the late 1970s was a prominent and well-documented tragedy. It's highly probable that a prankster or a storyteller, wanting to make the legend more sensational, simply swapped out the details of the DC-3 crash with the details of the DC-10 crash. The name DC-10 was far more recognizable and dramatic. This is a phenomenon known as retroactive continuity, or it's when details are added to a story after the fact to make it more exciting or to fit a new narrative. The original story of the DC-3 crash and the later story of the DC-10 crash were, in effect, retconned into a single, impossible legend. The prophetic newspaper article was never a single document. It was a blend of two historical events, a fictional mashup that became more powerful than either story on its own. The truth is, no verifiable 1939 newspaper containing the details of the 1979 crash has ever been found. Historians and debunkers have scoured the archives, and every time the trail leads to a dead end. The grainy photocopies and online forum posts are the only proof that exists. The story is a masterful example of what happens when a community wants to believe so badly that they fill in the blanks themselves. It's a story about the power of myth. It shows us how a simple, tragic coincidence can, through the lens of human psychology and the slow, steady process of storytelling, become a profound and deeply unsettling mystery. The real story isn't about the future reaching back to the past. It's about the past being rewritten by the present. So, while there were no time travelers, no prophets, and no grand conspiracy, the mystery itself reveals something just as profound about human nature, and that, in itself, is a story worth telling. At the heart of this legend lies a powerful psychological phenomenon. Our brain's innate desire to find patterns and meaning in a chaotic world. When we hear a story like the prophetic newspaper, a switch flips in our minds. We stop seeing it as two separate, unrelated events and start seeing it as a single, connected narrative. This isn't a flaw in our thinking. It's a fundamental part of what makes us human. It's called apophenia, the tendency to see meaningful connections between unrelated things. Think about it. Have you ever looked at a clock at 11:11 or 3:33 and thought it meant something? Or seen a recurring number and felt like it was a sign? Our brains are pattern recognition machines. We're constantly filtering the world, looking for signals and connections. In the case of the newspaper, we have a tragic crash and a historical document that seems to predict it. Our brains immediately want to connect the dots, to make the two events part of a single, coherent story. The alternative that it's just a bizarre coincidence or a clever hoax is far less satisfying. This is also tied to a concept called confirmation bias. Once we hear the story and believe it, we start looking for evidence to support it, while simultaneously ignoring or downplaying any evidence that contradicts it. We might focus on the blurry letters that look like DC-10 and completely disregard the fact that the original document has never been found. We want the story to be true, and so we unconsciously cherry-pick the details that reinforce our belief. The story also taps into our deep-seated need for control. The world can be a scary, unpredictable place. Planes crash, tragedies happen, and sometimes there's no rhyme or reason to it. That's a terrifying thought, but if we can believe that a crash was predicted 40 years in advance, it suddenly feels less random. It suggests that there's a hidden order, a grand design, a sense of fate. It allows us to believe that even in the face of chaos, there's a pattern, and perhaps, a meaning. The legend of the newspaper also plays on our shared cultural memory. The DC-10 crash was a national tragedy that touched millions of people. It's an event etched into the minds of a generation. By connecting it to an impossible, decades-old prophecy, the story creates a shared experience of wonder and mystery. It allows us to participate in the storytelling, to feel like we are part of a secret society of people who are in on the truth. It's a way of building community around a shared belief, no matter how outlandish it may be. So, while the newspaper article itself might be a fabrication, the story it tells is very real. It's a story about us. It's a story about how we process information, how we grieve, how we seek meaning, and how we turn a simple coincidence into a profound and lasting legend. It reminds us that the human mind is a powerful engine of storytelling, and that sometimes, the most incredible stories are the ones we tell ourselves. It's a powerful lesson, and it's a lesson that is just as relevant today as it was in a world full of information, both real and fake. Our ability to discern between a meaningful pattern and a random coincidence is more important than ever. So how does a legend like this survive? How does a story, built on a shaky foundation of dubious evidence and psychological quirks, manage to outlive the people who first told it? The answer lies in its ability to adapt and to thrive in different forms, moving from hushed whispers to the digital archives of the internet. For years, the story of the prophetic newspaper was a piece of fake lore passed around in chain letters and photocopies. It was the kind of story you'd read in a strange fringe publication, or hear whispered on late-night radio shows dedicated to the paranormal. It had a certain kind of underground appeal, a secret history that made you feel like you were in on something special. It was a story told and retold, with each teller adding a new detail or a new flourish, making it more personal and more compelling. But with the advent of the internet, the legend of the newspaper found a new home. Websites dedicated to urban legends and unsolved mysteries began to document the story, often presenting the blurry photocopies as irrefutable proof. Forums buzzed with debate, with believers and skeptics arguing over the nuances of the story. The internet didn't just preserve the legend, it supercharged it. It allowed a story that might have died out with a generation to find a brand new audience. The legend of the newspaper became a meme of sorts, a piece of cultural shorthand for a specific kind of historical anomaly. When people talk about eerie coincidences or possible time travel, this story is often one of the first ones that comes to mind. It's a go-to example because it's so perfectly constructed. It has all the elements of a great mystery, a historical artifact, a tragic event, and an impossible connection. It's a story that's just begging to be believed. But the legacy of the story isn't just about its survival. It's also about what it teaches us. The legend of the newspaper is a powerful cautionary tale about the nature of information. It reminds us that just because something is printed on a piece of paper, even an old, yellowed piece of paper, it doesn't mean it's true. It teaches us the importance of critical thinking, of questioning sources, and of not accepting things at face value. In a world where we are constantly bombarded with information, this lesson is more vital than ever. The story also serves as a testament to the enduring power of a good mystery. Even when the most logical and mundane explanation is presented, many people still choose to believe in the impossible. They choose to believe in time travel, in prophecy, in a world where the laws of physics can be bent just enough to create a perfect, chilling coincidence. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the point of a good mystery isn't to solve it, but to enjoy the journey of wondering. The legend of the 1939 newspaper that reported a 1979 crash is a beautiful artifact of human curiosity and imagination. It's a story that has transcended its origins and become something more than a hoax or a coincidence. It's a part of our collective folklore, a reminder that the line between fact and fiction is often a lot blurrier than we think. So, we've journeyed from a dusty, old newspaper in 1939 to the tragic crash of a DC-10 4 decades later. We've explored the wild possibilities of time travel, the grounded skepticism of a clever hoax, and the fascinating quirks of human psychology. But what, ultimately, does this incredible story mean? Why does it still resonate with us so deeply today? At its core, this legend is a powerful reflection of our relationship with information and authority. For generations, the printed word was seen as the absolute truth. If it was in the newspaper, it had to be real. The story of the prophetic paper, even as a hoax, challenges that assumption. It shows us that a document can look official, it can look authentic, but the information it contains can be completely false. In an age of deepfakes, AI-generated content, and online misinformation, this lesson is more relevant than ever. The legend reminds us to be critical consumers of information and to always question the source. The story also speaks to our desire for order and meaning in a chaotic universe. Life is often a series of random events, and tragedies can strike without warning or reason. It's a difficult truth to accept. The legend of the newspaper offers a different perspective, that maybe there is a hidden hand, a secret logic, a grand design that connects seemingly unrelated events. It's a comforting thought, a way of finding solace in the face of the incomprehensible. It's not about being right or wrong. It's about the human need to believe that there's a reason for everything, even if that reason is beyond our grasp. And finally, this legend is a testament to the power of a good story. As humans, we are wired for narrative. We love a plot with a beginning, a middle, and an end. We love a mystery with clues, suspects, and a big reveal. The story of the newspaper and the crash is a perfect narrative, a real-life thriller that has all the elements of a great film or a captivating book. It's a story that lives and breathes in the telling, evolving and changing with each new person who hears it. Whether it was a genuine historical anomaly, a clever fabrication, or a beautiful blend of both, the story has become a part of our collective cultural fabric. It's a story that asks big questions. Can we ever truly know the future? Is fate a real thing? How much of what we believe is based on evidence, and how much is based on our desire to believe? The legacy of the prophetic newspaper isn't about the answer. It's about the questions it forces us to ask. It's a story that reminds us that the world is a lot more mysterious, a lot more complex, and a lot more fascinating than we often give it credit for. And sometimes, the most profound truth isn't found in a perfectly preserved document, but in the rumors, the whispers, and the impossible stories that we choose to believe. We've reached the end of our journey. We've unspooled a legend that spanned 40 years, challenged our understanding of reality, and revealed some fascinating truths about ourselves. The story of the 1939 newspaper that reported a 1979 crash is, in a way, a perfect historical artifact. It's not a dusty document locked away in a museum. It's a living, breathing story that has adapted and evolved with each generation. What this story teaches us, more than anything, is the enduring power of a good mystery. Even in a world filled with instant information and endless facts, there's still a part of us that craves the unexplained, the impossible, the things that make us sit up and say, wait, what? The legend of the newspaper taps into that craving. It reminds us that there's still wonder to be found in the world, even if that wonder is rooted in a clever hoax or a simple coincidence. It also serves as a beautiful case study for why history matters. Not just the big events, the wars and the treaties, but the small, strange stories on the periphery. The urban legends, the tall tales, and the local rumors. These stories tell us just as much about who we are as a society as any textbook. They reveal our fears, our hopes, and our deep-seated need to find meaning in the chaos of life. So, the next time you hear a story that seems too good to be true, a coincidence that seems impossible, or a historical detail that doesn't quite add up, I challenge you to do two things. First, allow yourself to feel the wonder. Lean into the mystery. Let your mind wander to the possibilities of time travel and prophecies. It's a fun and valuable exercise for the imagination. But then, after the wonder has faded, do the second thing. Become a detective. Ask questions. Look for the flaws, the inconsistencies, the anachronisms. Don't be afraid to look for the truth, even if it's a little less exciting than the legend. Because the truth is, the world is full of things that are more amazing than any fiction we could invent. The real-life story of two separate crashes, a few blurry letters, and a generation of people who wanted to believe is, in its own way, just as profound as a story about a time-traveling journalist. It's a story about Usaba, our memories, our myths, and our endless search for a good narrative. And that, my friends, is a story that will never get old. What's the most mind-bending historical mystery you've ever heard? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey into the bizarre corners of history, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with a friend. Your support helps us keep these incredible stories alive. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.